All right, so today we're diving into something that, on the surface, might seem a little, well, dry, Danish foreign policy. But trust me on this one, this isn't just some boring diplomatic stuff. We're going to uncover some seriously ambitious goals hidden away in their official 2025 strategy document. And get this, Denmark is really stepping up on the world stage.
It's pretty amazing, actually. For a country of its size, the level of commitment Denmark's showing is impressive. This document we're looking at, it lays out their development assistance budget for 2025. And it's a hefty sum. We're talking 22.5 billion kroner.
Wait, do you say 22.5 billion? What is that in real money, like US dollars? That's got to be, what, over 3 billion? That's no small change, especially for a country the size of Denmark.
You got it. That's over 3 billion US dollars. And to put it into perspective, that translates to 0.7% of their entire gross national income, which by international standards, that's a huge commitment. They're putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to global responsibility, that's for sure.
Okay, so 0.7% of GNI. Billions of kroners.
Those are some serious numbers. It's pretty clear they're not messing around. But where exactly is all this generosity going?
Well, no surprises here. Ukraine is a major focus. They're significantly upping their support with a goal of really helping with all that rebuilding that needs to happen.
Yeah, that makes sense given, well, everything. But what does that support actually look like on the ground? Is it just a matter of sending funds, or are they taking a more targeted approach? Oh, it's definitely targeted. They're increasing their Ukraine fund to a total of 1.7 billion kroner, and a big chunk of that is going towards practical things like rebuilding essential infrastructure, the stuff that's crucial for getting everyday life back to some kind of normal. Plus, they're tackling corruption, which is crucial for long-term stability, and supporting the switch to green energy.
Green energy, huh? Now that's interesting. That a recurring theme throughout this document, or is it specifically tied to rebuilding efforts in Ukraine?
It's definitely a key theme overall, but for Ukraine, they're focusing those efforts on the Mykolaiv region specifically.
Mykolaiv, that's the shipbuilding region, right?
Right.
Right on the Black Sea.
Yeah.
The one that was hit pretty hard early on. I'm guessing Denmark's own expertise in shipbuilding and, of course, renewable energy makes that a bit of a strategic choice, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And here's another interesting tidbit. On top of this direct support, they're also putting another 2.5 billion kroner towards broader EU initiatives that are all about Ukraine's reconstruction and reforms. They're really going all in with a multi-layered approach to help get Ukraine back on its feet.
So not just a quick Band-Aid fix, but a real long-term commitment. Makes sense. So beyond Ukraine, what else is on Denmark's international to-do list?
Well, the document we're looking at puts a lot of emphasis on a renewed focus on Africa. In fact, it specifically says that its geopolitical importance, quote, has never been greater.
Africa. Okay, now we're talking about a whole different ballgame.
Right.
What does a stronger Danish-African relationship actually mean in a practical sense?
It put it simply, Denmark is earmarking a major chunk of its development assistance, a full 55%, which comes out to something like 9.7 billion kroner to projects in Africa.
Whoa, hold on, rewind that. Did you say 9.7 billion kroner? That's what, even more than they're putting towards Ukraine? Clearly, this Africa focus is a big deal for them. What exactly are they hoping to accomplish with that kind of investment, though?
It's basically a three-pronged strategy. First, boosting trade and investment. Second, promoting sustainable development. And third, creating opportunities specifically for young Africans. It's about establishing real, lasting partnerships, not just offering aid with one hand and taking with the other.
All right, three-pronged strategy. I like it. Sounds ambitious. Let's break that down a little. Starting with that first prong, boosting trade and investment. We're talking about like special trade deals, things like that.
Not exactly. They're upping their funding to something called the Investment Fund for Developing Countries, or IFU. And they're bumping it up to a cool 750 million kroner. Basically, think of IFU as a way to help Danish businesses get a foothold in emerging markets, especially in Africa.
So essentially encouraging their own companies to get more involved in Africa. Makes sense. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem, right? What about that second prong, sustainable development? How does Denmark see that playing out in Africa?
One of their major focuses is supporting green transitions and, more specifically, phasing out fossil fuels. They're actually dedicating a whole billion kroner just to water initiatives. The idea is to share their know-how in water management and tech to tackle the growing challenge of water scarcity.
Water scarcity. Now, that's not something you hear about every day, but with climate change, yeah, it makes total sense. A billion kroner is nothing to sneeze at. But what will those funds actually be used for?
They're setting up this new water facility that's specifically designed to promote and support investments in countries like Ghana, Uganda, Rwanda, and South Africa. These investments will go toward things like upgrading water infrastructure, implementing better management practices, and of course, improving access to clean water in those countries.
Sounds like they're really serious about creating a sustainable future for Africa.
Hmm.
But what about that third prong, the bit about opportunities for young Africans? Where does that fit in?
That one's all about investing in people. They're talking about expanding education and exchange programs, making it easier for African students to study in Denmark and the other way around. They're also looking at boosting collaborations in the arts, building bridges between Danish and African artists, and even civil society groups.
So a really well-rounded approach then, covering everything from the economy and infrastructure to education and cultural exchange. It's pretty ambitious, to say the least.
Ambitious, definitely, but also strategic. For example, they're creating this dedicated Africa window within the IFU.
Africa Window. Okay, I'm listening. What's that all about?
So it's basically a 100 million kroner initiative that's specifically designed to encourage more collaboration between businesses in Denmark and Africa. The whole idea is to promote innovation and, of course, create more opportunities for growth, both in Denmark and in Africa.
Gotcha. So it's not just about Danish companies going in and, setting up shop, but actually working with and creating partnerships with African businesses.
Exactly. It's about both sides leveraging each other's strengths and ultimately creating a win-win situation. And, this whole focus on trade and investment as a major driver of sustainable development, that's pretty interesting, I think.
It really makes you think about the whole traditional model of aid, right? Like this seems like such a different way of approaching things and potentially a lot more sustainable and empowering in the long run.
100%. It really begs the question, is this a more effective way to create lasting change? Or, is there maybe a place for both approaches, depending on the situation?
Now, that is a good question. And honestly, probably one without any easy answers. It likely depends on the specific context, right? But it's clear that Denmark is really trying to change the game here,
Yeah.
moving away from that old donor-recipient dynamic towards something that feels more like a true partnership.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of partnerships, while it's clear that Ukraine and Africa are major priorities for them, they're not ignoring other things happening around the world.
So they're not putting all their eggs in two baskets, so to speak. What does their engagement with other humanitarian crises look like?
Well, they're setting aside a significant amount, about 3.8 billion kroner, towards humanitarian aid and what they call Nexus initiatives.
Nexus initiatives. Okay, now I'm interested. Tell me more.
They're really interesting. They're all about bridging that gap between, like, immediate humanitarian aid after a crisis and then those long-term development efforts. It's a much more integrated approach to things.
Nexus initiatives. I like that. It's like they're
Right.
breaking down the silos, recognizing that emergency relief and sustainable development, they really go hand in hand. You don't want to just put out fires, right? You want to help communities rebuild in a way that's better and makes them more resilient.
Absolutely. And with climate change just making everything worse, like escalating conflicts and humanitarian crises, this whole integrated approach, it's more important now than ever.
It makes you wonder how this will all play out with Denmark's diplomatic efforts, especially with them being on the UN Security Council soon. Does the document say anything about their priorities in that area?
It does, actually. It specifically mentions how committed they are to strengthening crisis management and conflict prevention, working within the UN framework, especially when it comes to Africa.
Okay, so they're focusing on Africa there too.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But Africa's a big place with a lot going on. Anything more specific about what they're focused on?
Well, they seem particularly concerned about the rise of authoritarianism, armed conflicts, and the increase in violent extremism, all those things.
Yeah, those are definitely major global issues that need attention, no doubt.
Okay.
What's their plan for tackling all of that head on?
They emphasize multilateralism a lot. They really seem to believe that the only way to solve these really complex problems is through strong alliances, especially with like-minded countries in Africa who are also committed to peace and working together on the world stage. And to back that up, they're going to increase how much they contribute to the Peace and Stabilization Fund.
So they're not afraid to step up and play a more active role globally, using their financial resources, obviously, but also their diplomatic influence to make a difference.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And it all circles back to that pretty impressive commitment they made, that 0.7% of their gross national income that they're dedicating to development assistance. It's one thing to talk the talk, but they're actually walking the walk.
I'll say, it's pretty impressive when you really think about the big picture here. Their commitment to Ukraine, This renewed focus on Africa, the support for global humanitarian efforts, their role on the UN Security Council, it paints a picture of a country that's really engaged in what's happening around the world and determined to make a real positive difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Uh-huh.
It's clear that Denmark isn't content just sitting on the sidelines. They're actively shaping their foreign policy based on their values and priorities. And honestly, that's something worth paying attention to.
Definitely. Before we wrap things up, any final thoughts for our listeners, something to mull over?
I think the big takeaway for me after getting a glimpse into Denmark's foreign policy priorities is this. How do you see smaller countries like Denmark actually influencing how we respond to these huge, complex global challenges?
Ooh, that's a good one. Are they in a better position to kind of take the lead on specific issues, especially in areas where they have expertise? Or do you think they make a bigger impact working within larger groups, like the EU or the UN?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it really gets at the heart of how global power works. Like, do you have to be a superpower to really change things? Or can smaller countries, by playing to their strengths, working with others, can they have just as big of an impact?
It's a tough question, for sure. Not one with an easy answer. We could probably debate that for hours. But I think what's clear is that Denmark is really trying to forge its own path. It'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out for them.
It really will. This whole deep dive into Danish foreign policy has been, honestly, kind of eye-opening. Who knew a policy document could be so, dare I say, interesting? Right. It's easy to get lost in all the official language and stuff, but when you take a step back and really look at what they're saying, you realize these documents are about way more than just diplomacy. They reflect a country's values, their hopes for the future, and, their commitment to making the world a better place.
Totally. And it's a good reminder that foreign policy, it's not just some abstract idea, right? It has real consequences, real impact on people's lives all over the world.
100%. It's about tackling those big, messy problems, building bridges between different countries, and ultimately working together to create a future that's, well, more just, more sustainable for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, a huge thank you to you for walking us through all of this.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Danish foreign policy. Definitely a lot to think about. Until next time.